afternoon. Welcome to the New America Foundation. I'm Peter Bergen, Director of the National Security Program here. It's with a lot of pleasure that I want to introduce Bill Banks, who is the founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism at Syracuse University. He's an internationally recognized authority on national security law. In fact, he almost invented the field. Counterterrorism, constitutional law. He's publishing today this category-killing paper, category-killing in the sense that I don't think anybody's going to be able to write anything on this subject again without reference to this paper, The Legal Landscape for Emergency Management in the United States. Professor Banks has been a member of the faculty at Syracuse for 30 years, and he's a frequent collaborator with the New America Foundation. And so it's really with a lot of pleasure that I introduce him to you right now. He's going to speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll open it to Q&A.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. That's a nice introduction, but 30 years, that can't be. If I'm 35 years old, how could it be that I'm teaching at Syracuse for 30 years? I'm afraid it's true, but I'm aging gracefully. I do have quite a tree-killing paper out there, and you're certainly welcome to pick one up on your way out if you didn't get one on the way in. It's a very dense paper. There's a lot of detail there, and I imagine from the variety of backgrounds that are represented here in the audience that there are a number of different aspects that might be of interest to you, but I'd be shocked if it's all of interest to you. So what I'll attempt to do is sort of an overview. I'll skate sort of lightly across a few areas, and then after 20 minutes or so we could have a conversation, and feel free to join in, and we'll see where we can go with this. I think the way to begin is to say that in the United States, the overarching characteristic of emergency management in the year 2011 is inadequate integration and coordination of a wide range of civilian and military, governmental, private sector, and non-governmental organization participants in preparedness and response. Even before the 9/11 attacks, we in the United States had begun a tendency to develop what you might think of as a top-down, all-hazards approach with command and control components in dealing with emergency management. I believe that experience and research indicates instead that emergency management in the United States is more nearly chaotic, working from the bottom up with support from the federal government. I think there are signs in 2011, begun really last year and in 2009, that there's some maturing going on in the federal apparatus. As many of you may know, the first ever quadrennial Homeland Security Review, a report promulgated in February of last year, just about exactly a year ago now. It's called the Strategic Framework for a Secure Homeland, is evidence, I think, of a maturing approach to Homeland Security preparedness and response. It states that Homeland Security describes an intersection of evolving threats and hazards with traditional governmental and civic responsibilities of civil defense, emergency response, law enforcement, customs, border control, and immigration. In fashioning one government entity to manage these responsibilities, DHS, says the report, breaks down long-standing stovepipes. That sounds very good. Creates a greater emphasis on a need for joint actions and efforts across previously discrete elements of government and society. That sounds very good too. The same document, the QHSR, envisions Homeland Security's involving collective efforts and shared responsibilities of all governmental, non-governmental, and private sector partners in an enterprise to maintain critical Homeland Security capabilities. It adopts a promise to ensure resilience to disasters. That, of course, is sort of a watchword these days, one of its core missions. And it recognizes that doing so will require a significant change in U.S. emergency management from a primary focus on response and recovery to one that takes a wider view, balancing response and recovery with mitigation and preparedness. So, concludes the report, there'll be a shift from a reliance on top-down emergency management to a process that engages all stakeholders and promotes a regional response capacity, unity of effort, and increased military, civilian, and public-private partnerships for preparedness and response. The language is terrific. The report is very forward-looking. It's a year old. We're going to have to give it some time to see if it, in fact, can be implemented in anywhere near the aspirational language that was used in the report. Here are my sort of summary points that I think characterize the state of emergency preparedness and response in the United States today. The overarching complicator is our federal system. It's perhaps the best system of government in the world, but it's also one that complicates a great deal many of the things that we try to do. And its authorities and responsibilities for domestic preparedness and response are only ambiguously provided for in our federal system. So there's a lot of opportunity for headbutting, missed signals, turf wars, missed opportunities at cooperation and the like. I'll say more about that. Next, our communities are becoming, I think, increasingly interconnected, particularly in urban areas, and they rely on vulnerable modes of transportation, communication, provision of public utilities and other services, and the lack of resilience in our infrastructure and most of those attributes leads to some grave consequences from either natural disasters or terrorist attacks. So a third point I would make is that the federal government has, over time, and continues to this day, to provide confusing mandates and relatively poor planning direction for state and local governments. The federal funding priorities have tended to exacerbate some distortions in local planning where a lot of attention, perhaps disproportionate attention, is paid to very small likelihood terrorist incidents instead of more likely natural disasters. Fourth, I think the legal authorities in this area stop short of providing clear legal prescription for responsibilities to implement many of the measures that should be implemented. And finally, the coordination plans, they're out there. There are many of them. I'll touch on a couple of things. They're mostly untested, and relatively few exercises nationwide have been conducted. DHS worked at exercising hard right after its startup in 2002, but that exercising program was not well received. There were a lot of flaws in execution, and there hasn't been an effective exercising of the plans and programs to date. So, a few things about the federal organization. First, our constitutional system. It's a remarkable one. If you're not law trained, your introduction to our Constitution may go back to civics courses or basic American government. One of the things that you may remember is that our Constitution does not, for the most part, contemplate emergencies. And that may be because, in the words of one of our most famous Supreme Court justices, emergency powers tend to kindle emergencies. So our Constitution presupposes that its structures and processes and fundamental institutions, rights of citizens and the like will be in play during times of normality as well as times of great crisis. In fact, aside from the provision that grants some part of our government the opportunity to suspend a writ of habeas corpus in time of grave emergency, there's virtually no other mention of emergency in our Constitution. There is a provision that allows for the federal government to assure the states have a so-called Republican form of government. And if there is an insurrection or a rebellion or domestic violence of such a magnitude as threatens the Republican character of a state government, then there's an opportunity for the national government to intervene militarily in their protection. That's an extraordinary authority. It's very seldom been exercised in our history. We could talk about a couple of examples if you like. But the fundamental point is that the Constitution is relatively silent. So at the same time, as you all must know, the federal government has for a long time taken the leadership role in disaster preparedness and response. The codification of the authority to lead is primarily codified in something called the Stafford Act. Many of you know the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act has been around in codified form since the 1970s. It's essentially the modern incarnation of disaster relief that was developed episodically from the 19th century forward in response to disasters one at a time. And the Stafford Act confers sweeping authorities on the president to lead a federal emergency preparedness and response effort. The essence of Stafford authority is really disaster relief. It's not written to contemplate countering terrorism, although its authorities could be used in that wake. A lot of, as you probably know, in the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, one of the byproducts of kludging together so many federal administrative agencies and so many personnel into a new entity, the largest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947. Not an easy thing to do. What is it, 180,000 workers, 19 previously discrete agencies, and so on. At any rate, one of the byproducts of standing up DHS was to diminish to some degree the fluency and capabilities of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which before creation of DHS was a semi-independent entity. Once buried inside DHS, it lost a little vitality, and when Hurricane Katrina came along in 2005, you'll recall that the preparedness and response was not efficacious. Let's put it that way. Almost immediately in the wake of Katrina and the after-action reports that came out of the Senate, the House, the White House, and anybody else who was paying much close attention, Congress revised Stafford and revised some DHS authorities in something that's described in the paper called the PK Post-Katrina Emergency Management Act, the PKEMRA 2006. And fortunately for us all, by virtue of the authorities in that revision in 2006, FEMA's status has been elevated inside the department. Some of its authorities have been restored, and in terms of emergency preparedness and response, now the FEMA director is clearly the DHS point person. It wasn't so clear at the time of FEMA. You may recall that the Secretary Chertoff at the time was obligated to declare an incident of national significance before the federal apparatus could literally participate in the response or anticipation and response of Katrina. It took some days, 72 hours about, for the Secretary to make that determination. In inadequate communication, some confusion on the ground, and certainly by the time the designation was made, a lot of damage that could have been averted had already been completed, had already occurred. In the wake of the 2006 revision, the PKEMRA, the federal apparatus has matured considerably. There's now, instead of what used to be called a National Response Plan, there's now a National Response Framework. The mechanisms that the framework describes, these, of course, are all transparent and available online. A couple of clicks will get you to these plans. It's an impressive set of mechanisms now, with still a lot of ambiguity about roles and assignments. The planning language is only a couple of years dated now. It sort of presages this Homeland Security review, the quadrennial review that I spoke of a few moments ago. But as we say, the devil is in the details, and there aren't many details. So we'll have to examine that. The piece of the federal response that I think is most problematic, and perhaps worthy of some discussion here when we open it up in a few minutes, is the public health component. As many of you may know, public health authority and policy and management in the United States has historically been a matter for state and local governments. It's a tribute of our federal system. Bring government to the lowest common denominator, make government active and effective where it's closest to the people. That's what you might have learned in your 5th grade civics course, and indeed it plays out in the legacy of public health management and control in the United States. Problem, of course, is that public health is usually at the lower end of the public budget set of priorities in all 50 states. The public health preparedness in the states and localities has historically been lacking. The legal regulation for public health until the last few years was by and large a 19th century product. Concerns about livestock, other agricultural issues related to diseases in animals and the like, quarantines. So only in most, really certainly since the anthrax letters of 2001, but more so even since Hurricane Katrina and Rita have state and local officials worked hard to revise public health authorities in tandem with efforts by the national government to be helpful in coordinating role. I say helpful in a coordinating role because by and large the federal government doesn't have the authority to carry out emergency response in the area of public health. It's because of our Constitution as well as the design of federal statutes and regulations. The Constitution says, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, that the federal government may not commandeer. That's a verb that was used by the Supreme Court of the United States. May not commandeer state and local resources in furtherance of a federal aim. So the only way that the feds can impose a public health response on the states is, one, if the states agree. If the states take the money from the feds in return for a promise to participate, or if the feds do the work themselves in the state with federal officials and federal dollars. Otherwise, public health remains a state and local concern. And as a result of that sort of constitutional dynamic, the federal public health response has been limited to developing through the CDC and some other entities, the Surgeon General's office, some guidelines about the transmission of infectious diseases, some recommendations for state and local governments about steps that they may take, and guidelines which would give the government authority to stop a person entering the United States if she or he is diagnosed as having some kind of a communicable disease. There's no federal authority to intervene in a public health crisis inside a state or inside a city, or one that adjoins two states or cities, say a metropolitan area in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and the like. And the proposed regulations that might have given it some authority to do that over the last few years were never promulgated, I think in part on the advice of the lawyers, that the government may lack the authority to impose regulations to intervene in an interstate or intrastate public health crisis. And as a result of that lack of federal regulatory action, and really the lack of federal resources devoted here, there was a model act developed a few years ago here in town at Johns Hopkins with some cooperative effort at Georgetown University called the Model State Health Emergency Preparedness Act, MSHEPA. It's described in my paper. There are links to it. You can find it easily. And it was an act which was an attempt to modernize the state of emergency preparedness and response in the states and cities by offering a code that states could adopt either in part or in whole to make their emergency response mechanisms more efficacious. Over the last 5 years, 37 states have adopted the Model Act in one form or another. Some sort of lock, stock, and barrel. Some have taken pieces. Some have amended it slightly. If you look at the Act, it's very government-friendly. It confers sweeping powers on state and local officials to take actions to avert a public health crisis. Can institute quarantine, isolation of persons, forced relocation, It could suspend state and local laws. It can give local public health officials the authority to do that. It can suspend constitutional freedoms for the citizens to have fair process before their property is taken, or they're told they can't go home, or they're told they can't leave home. It's quite an extraordinary model, and I think it's been given insufficient attention. Ironically, my own state, New York, has adopted the Model Act almost lock, stock, and barrel. And in the last few weeks, a legal manual that describes how that new Model Act would work in New York State has been promulgated by a group of lawyers and judges in New York City. It's available, I think it's still on the New York Times website. You can find it. It's called the New York State Public Health Legal Manual. It's really a little bit frightening because it provides in such sweeping yet dry language the authority of the state to essentially suspend ordinary functioning of state laws and processes in the event of a public health crisis that could be determined by an official not elected by the people, say a public health administrator. So there's an area to investigate. Let me move on and get to a couple of other things and then conclude so that we can have a conversation. There are two other areas, I think, that deserve brief mention. One is our problem of policing and intelligence gathering. Because of our federal system and because of our constitutional freedoms, the civil liberties that we hold so dearly, particularly the First Amendment, free expression, and the Fourth Amendment, right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, we have always separated the function of policing or law enforcement from intelligence gathering in this country. And we have also always regarded the policing or law enforcement function as one of those, like public health, that should be performed by the lowest common denominators of our government: city cops, state and local police. So it's a fragmented system. It's highly decentralized. But as you know, in this era, not just with regard to natural disasters, say the H1N1 or some other naturally occurring contagion, but also in the event of terrorism and the threats of terrorism from abroad and at home, the need to collect intelligence is paramount. So you try to meld together the intelligence gathering function with the policing function, and there's a great opportunity for mixed signals, inadequate cooperation and coordination, turf battles, information sharing lapses, and confrontation. And all of those things have occurred in abundance over the recent years. There have been some steps taken to ameliorate some of the worst byproducts of that decentralization, such as state and local fusion centers, which try to marry state and local law enforcement with federal to share information about matters going on in state and local communities. The National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC, which is an attempt to bring all agencies involved in the federal intelligence gathering enterprise together to share information and to, quote, connect the dots that were so wanting, we thought, after 9/11. And in addition to NCTC and fusion centers, joint terrorism task forces, which try to marry federal and state and local law enforcement in some fashion. It's a work in progress. I think there's a fair amount of criticism in the last few years about the potential that the FBI, our federal law enforcement agency, which is also responsible for federal intelligence gathering in the United States, may be overreaching a bit. In my paper, I described some incidents where it may be that the FBI acted in excess of its authorities in undertaking some investigations of domestic groups without any kind of threat having been reported or without any indication that unlawful activity had been engaged in. There was a report issued earlier this year by the Brennan Center in New York City that came to similar conclusions from that I did in my paper, that FBI guidelines that have allowed these sort of pre-threat investigations, what are called in lawyers' terms non-predicated investigations. In other words, there's no predicate for a formal investigation. These investigations have been specifically authorized by the Attorney General since 2008, and there's some indication that the authority that they depict may have been abused on more than one occasion. Finally, talking about the military roles for a moment, I think, as I said at the outset, in talking about the Constitution, there's only a limited reference in the document itself to the possibility that the military may be involved somehow in our homeland. The thought, and of course, in the late 18th century was worried about foreign invaders and the chance of Indian uprisings and things like that. And indeed, in the modern era, we've embraced an idea that comes from a 19th century law called posse comitatus. You may have heard that phrase. Posse comitatus, of course, is Latin that simply refers to the posse that would be organized to help a sheriff with private support to bring in wrongdoers. The principle in the United States, though, was to separate the military from civilian law enforcement and to establish a presumption that the military would not be involved in our civilian lives. And it's a legal presumption as well as a policy presumption, and I think by and large the presumption is alive and well. However, as was illustrated most vividly, I think, in the response to Hurricane Katrina a few years ago, had the military not been capable and very, very competent in response to that disaster, things would have been far worse than they were. Because of all the entities that were involved in the Katrina operation and response, it was the Coast Guard first, and the active duty and reserve and National Guard military forces that probably were the most efficacious in carrying out their assigned roles. There's a lot of planning that's been done to anticipate that National Guard and Reserve and potentially even active duty military could be brought to bear on a domestic crisis. Those plans have not been well trained or exercised, and there are two words that would explain that: Iraq and Afghanistan. They're otherwise occupied. But if that operational tempo of our force does decrease over time, it may well be that we'll see a more fully primed military capability that could be brought to bear in a crisis such as a public health crisis. I have my own sort of mixed feelings about that eventuality, but it certainly provides a set of resources in domestic preparedness and response that can't be matched, of course, by any other part of our government. So, to conclude the formal part of my remarks, I would simply say that the state of emergency preparedness and response, I think, in the United States is a bit confused. It lacks coordinating mechanisms. It lacks sufficient detail to guide the exercise of discretion by important officials who have significant responsibility to carry out tasks. Our federal system makes it much more complicated than it would otherwise be, but the federal system, of course, has a beauty of preserving for state and local officials the primary responsibility for their own citizens, and that's the way it should be. Thank you. Let's have a conversation.
Anybody feel free to ask a question. Bill will identify yourself and your affiliation.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, Mark Medley from the Joint Staff. I'm just interested in your comments about infectious disease. Just your thoughts on what's going on in Haiti right now, kind of a model, not only in terms of organization, but also process responsive to cholera outbreak there. The process resembles very closely what we would try to do in the United States. It's less than effective. Have you looked at that as maybe a laboratory for some of your ideas for us to reflect on how we do it here in the United States?
Yeah, I have, and that the Haiti situation is very eye-opening. Of course, Haiti's not a federal republic, and as I said in my remarks a few moments ago, there's a real difficulty in anticipating contagious disease outbreak in the United States because of federalism. There was a fair amount of work done after the anthrax letters. I was involved with Richard Danzig and some others doing some work for DHS in 2003, 4, and 5, and we developed some scenarios and tried to predict what might happen, for example, with a smallpox outbreak, whether it be, well, it would be intentionally disseminated, of course. Because of the lack of federal authority to interdict interstate movement of persons or to control an outbreak in a city or between states in a metropolitan area, I think there could be a very, very difficult response to an event like that. And the only way that the feds could be actively involved would be based upon a request from the governors of the affected states. And you would hope that in such an eventuality that the governors would be proactive and would allow the federal assets to be deployed, pre-positioned in sort of a push rather than a pull fashion, be ready to be activated. But those plans have not been exercised since the top-off exercises went by the wayside a few years ago. And in addition, of course, there's very little outside of the military. There's very little federal resource that could be devoted, aside from pushing, drugs up a chain through a distribution system in the event that you've got something that can be treated with an antibiotic or something. So I think it's the gravest kind of threat that we could face, maybe aside from a nuclear weapon. But I think germs they're the stream that keep me awake at night sometimes. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Deborah Robinson, National Legal Preparedness Training Project, UDC. And maybe my question relates to what you were making about the federal government giving confusing mandates or guidance. What we're finding, or a question that we get from emergency managers, is what is the status of guidance? Like all the guidance that FEMA and other people put out. Is that suggestion, strongly suggested? You must do if you're getting federal funds. It's real difficult for us. So do you have any sense of to what extent, what's the status of guidance?
Yeah. I think you've put your finger on one of the biggest difficulties in this whole field. It's not clear, it's not direct, it's not prescriptive for the most part. It's been we suggest, we recommend, here's what you should do. And it's often written in very open-ended language with lots of room for interpretation. Part of the explanation for that, of course, is federalism, respect for state and local prerogatives. Part of it might be legal for fear that the feds lack authority to prescribe the state and local officers, and they're reluctant to push that authority. This commandeering principle that I mentioned, of course, is a fairly limited one, isn't it? Short of commandeering, the feds can set policy. They do it all the time, so long as there's a connection to the national economy, for example. And, of course, everything we're talking about has a profound connection to the national economy. And then an additional reason, of course, is simply partisan politics. Our representatives in Congress are worried about this from different perspectives, aren't they? So they want to preserve the discretion for their state and local officials to exercise judgment about the kinds of plans that should be in place for their community, yet they recognize that without adequate direction from the national government that those plans won't be well shaped. So I wish you Godspeed in your job. I hope that you can succeed in that. Yes, sir.
Gordon Burke, and I was involved with the team who was putting together the maneuver Domenici response plan.
Yeah.
When we went down to talk to FEMA in '96, we actually talked to the guy who was writing the annex to the plan to deal with terrorism. And what he told us was the irony of this was that it had gone from a plan which was directed to a framework which was suggestive.
Yes.
Even though we now have Ruby Ridge, Waco, Tokyo, which are all domestic terrorism kind of cases.
Right.
McVeigh was prosecuted
Yeah.
under very federal law.
Yes.
That actually implemented the Biological Weapons Convention.
That's
It's
correct.
almost an international type law.
Right.
Yet, that's sort of in the middle of the Clinton administration. They gave up the directive role and backed off to a suggestive one.
Yeah.
I wonder if you know sort of what was the thinking at that time specifically that backed off.
Well, there was some legal advice that caught. This was the era in which the Supreme Court put the brakes on some federal authority. The brakes were placed on areas that had nothing to do with Homeland Security or preparedness and response or disasters. Remember the Brady handgun bill, background checks? That was one of the cases where the Supreme Court said, no, you can't require a sheriff to do all that much. They don't, so there were a lot of reasons for that had nothing to do with the kind of concerns that you're talking about. But there was a lot of reticence, I think, that began to creep into the federal legal apparatus at the time about imposing these rules on states and locals in fear that the Supreme Court would go further and tie the hands of federal authorities. So that may be another part of the explanation for the predicament that you described as well. So one of the things that's happened in this decade doesn't manage or respond to these grave kind of doomsday scenarios, but maybe for the aggregate disaster preparedness and response, a healthy sign is that informal networks have been cleaved together to find ways to fashion a disaster plan that would respond to their particular environment. Disaster response networks that historically, some of you may know, came from learning how to fight fires in Northern California 100 years ago. Who's good? Who knows something about the local community? Where can we get the chemicals we need to deal with the fire? How can we get people up the tree line? How can we get eyes on the forest, and who are the weather people, and who in town knows the way, where the winds usually blow from on a given day of the week? You put a mechanism together that brings a network. The network convenes and meets and decides what their ground rules will be, who's in charge, who reports to who, and it simply operates in an ad hoc fashion, sometimes very effectively. There's more of that going on now. And I think you won't find it in the United States Code. You won't even find it, for the most part, in state regulations or laws in any of the states. You'll find it in informal arrangements between governmental and non-governmental entities. A few weeks ago, I think I have it back here. It's not important, the detail, but the FEMA administrator has started a program to invite private sector in to discuss how networked arrangements could be developed that would allow FEMA to back away from some of the responsibilities it has in given areas. FEMA just provides they have a nice room like this with tables and chairs, and they bring in the private sector to figure out a plan for dealing with it themselves. That's somewhat hopeful, I think, and encouraging. Peter.
Well, a couple of questions. When Liam Panetta was going through his confirmation hearings, he sort of seemed to take a punt on the question of the possibility of an extraordinary rendition. Do you think are the authorizations for an extraordinary rendition still sort of extant, and are there any other things that are on the books that might be problematic, similar to that, and also to what extent is the authorization for the use of military force kind of the animating legal principle for some of those things, if at all?
Right. So you're talking about a terrorism paradigm, so different from natural disaster, and one of the extreme methods available to the government, at least during the time of the Bush administration, was to render a suspect who may have been in the United States, Arar, the Canadian, for example, to a third country for interrogation on the suspicion that he has connections to terrorism. The practice has not been disavowed by the Obama administration. I think you're right to say that Leon Panetta punted in response to that question in his confirmation hearings. And even though President Obama clearly forbade torture in his executive orders in the first few days of his administration, the executive orders are silent on the practice of extraordinary rendition. Indeed, this administration has continued to defend the government in some ongoing litigation by those victimized by such renditions, including in the Supreme Court of the United States in a case that's on the docket this term called Mohammed. And there's another case that you may know, the Jeppesen Data Plan case, which is challenging the role of a nominally private airplane company to provide the means for rendering a suspect from one place to another. Mr. Arar from New York to Syria, for example. The AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, the authority that Congress enacted a few days after 9/11 to give the president the authority to use all necessary and appropriate force. That's the language. I think I've read it so often now that I'll never forget the language. All necessary and appropriate force to go after those responsible for 9/11. It's a little more artful than that, but that's the essence of it. So we're coming up on 10 years now, 9.5, of the living with the authority, the discretion, the broad discretion that granted the president. So the significance, of course, is that it was the functional equivalent of a declaration of war. And it was a declaration unlike any that has ever been rendered in the United States because it didn't identify an enemy. It did not identify a battle space. And it did not identify an objective, an endpoint. How will we know when it's over? So many have begun to wonder just what the contours are with respect to those indicators. The Obama administration has, on its own initiative, calibrated the language of the AUMF a bit through the legal advisor's office in the State Department and some other utterances by the Attorney General to make it clear that its authority extends to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and affiliated organizations. A little bit of gloss, if you will, on the original authority. But there's no further delineation of a battlefield or the duration of the authority that was given by Congress. Nor how will we know when we're finished, when we've won or we've lost or however we choose to characterize it. So. Yes, sir.
I'm Gerald Epstein at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This question may be more political with a small p than legal, but is one of the problems here that it's extremely difficult for leaders to anticipate an incredibly unusual, extraordinary circumstance when it's business as usual. And it may not be at the level of legal authorities, but planning how you're going to do triage or what you're going to do in a devastating disaster in a peacetime situation forces you to make choices that are completely unacceptable to people who know they would be affected but can't imagine the actual consequences of that. And I guess that translates into willingness to grant or not grant emergency powers.
That's right. I think that's a great question, and I think you put your finger on exactly the kind of work that needs to go on now. It's not lawyers' work, or it's lawyers in the room with folks such as you, people who understand uncertainty and making decisions in the event of extreme uncertainty. We've never been good at that. And I think our planning is done in such open-ended language with little prescription and insufficient detail, in part because we failed to grapple with that set of questions. So what do? Do you grant broad-brushed authorities and say to the officials, well, you figure it out when the time comes, you'll know what to do? Or do you try to provide a more detailed recipe? The president, as you may know, has, in addition to his constitutional authorities, what are usually referred to as standby legislative authorities. In the morning of September 11th, 2001, President Bush, relying on standby legislative authorities, declared a national emergency. And the moment he declared a national emergency, he was empowered there to do a whole range of things by virtue of the authority granted in a statute that had been around for 40 years. There are about 40 or more of these standby legislative authorities that give the president the authority to take extraordinary measures in the event of a crisis. So there's one approach. You try to spell out in advance in a planning sort of document what conditions would trigger the exercise of this authority, and then the official, the responsible official, be it a president or a governor, perhaps a mayor, would take the initiative at the time. Now, problem, of course, with those authorities is that they aren't regularly reviewed. They may not be timely. They may not be sufficiently attentive to changed circumstances and lessons learned from other disasters or crises or attacks. So many of the standby authorities have been around for 40 years. It's better now than it used to be. Until the National Emergencies Act was enacted in around 1970, there had been some that had been around since the 19th century. This time, Congress cleaned house and repealed all existing authorities and then enacted a new law called the National Emergencies Act. But that's what the president does in the event of a Hurricane Katrina. That's what he does on a 9/11. That's what President Clinton did in Oklahoma City, and so on. So there's one approach. But I think the problems you suggest are really difficult ones, and it's going to take, I think, a range of talent and experience to figure out how best to grapple with that. There's some effort going on in our government that's gone on from time to time called developing a continuity of government plan. If we're decapitated, if leadership is decapitated in an attack, how do we go on? And it's COG, continuity of government. That's the acronym. The city is full of acronyms, and that's one that is not transparent, but it's one that anticipates the worst and tries to lay out in advance a plan. It's depressing, isn't it? Yes, sir.
Jim Monk with Congressional Research Service. Going back to some of the questions over here that where you were talking about the informal networks that are being developed, I agree that it's hopeful because it's better than the alternative of not having networks develop and not having, plans. But by that existence, doesn't it sort of explain or exacerbate the ambiguity of chains of command in emergencies? Because you have one sector that's got an informal network, or maybe more formal network, and another sector doesn't. And so the NRF and DHS, is at this whole government, whole country level. And so so I guess my ultimate question then is there a better model that doesn't have the ambiguity, or are we stuck with it by nature of having the federal system? The context that I come at this from at CRS is agriculture, and the question I get a lot from staff is who's in charge if something happens to food production or food safety? Is it USDA or is it DHS, or does it depend once we determine if it's accidental or intentional? DHS doesn't know what to do because they don't have 100,000 people who know about animals, that kind of thing, And so are we stuck with the ambiguity, or is there a better way?
Well, you clearly know a lot about the subject and all of the questions that you just raised. I think, the answers are always yes. And they don't get you very far, do they, those answers? That kind of sort of fumbling would go on, wouldn't it? So I'm not sure I know the answer to your question, but I would like to see more of both. I would like to see some drilling down on the ambiguities. We can do better. We can help. We can offer more precision. And we can push the envelope a bit in terms of the federal-state relationship, particularly if state and local officials buy in. One of the, aside from networks, one of the most hopeful signs in emergency preparedness and response, some of you would know about this, is called EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. Interstate compacts are a feature of our system. And the EMAC, which was a product of response to hurricanes, particularly in the South, Florida for the most part, the southern states began to say, look, we've got to share resources here in case we have another, I forget the names of those ones that were so devastating in the 60s and 70s. Well, it started, and now every state is a member of the EMAC. And in Katrina, there was some effective response attributable to the shared resources that different states could bring through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. The Compact has its own management and structure. States sign MOUs. Here's what we can afford to contribute under these circumstances. So it helps to break down the federalism barrier through agreement. So agreement is a good thing. Agreement is like a network. It's a little more formalized in this respect. So if we could do a little more with networks, a little more with agreements that could be between governments, and then offer a little more precision in the sort of top-down. Certainly DOA and DHS should be able to figure out an MOU that says what you do if you've got animals or crops. Similar arrangements had to be done, and I believe they were done, between DHS and HHS on communicable diseases. As you know, the Department of the Public Health Service is in HHS, not DHS. So what do you do when you've got a disease outbreak? Who's in charge? Similarly, they're sort of looking at each other, and there's turf, but that can be, I think that can be fixed. Good question. Yes, sir.
My name is Ian Moss, and I'm a third-year law student at GW. My question relates to shrinking budgets, particularly at the local and state levels, and what impact they may have on our ability to prepare.
I think it's grave. That's an excellent question. I don't have any kind of prescription for this, but I pay a fair amount of attention to that situation in my own state, New York, which is in a very difficult fiscal situation. Public health budgets are getting gutted. They're getting gutted, and the state and local officials, for example, are worried about surge. If there was an incident, whether it be a terrorism-related or a natural disaster, could they handle the surge in patient volume that would come to emergency rooms in a given area? In central New York, where I live, there are public health departments in 5 or 6 surrounding counties are working now to understand the limits that they would have in the event of a crisis like that. So it's an area that I think is going to suffer in the coming years, and without some federal intervention, I think through financial support in particularly public health preparedness, I think that the good job that many of the public health departments have done in the last 10 years, I think may actually wither away a bit because of lack of resources. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Mark Mickleby again, Joint Staff. I would want to go back to where you're just talking about in terms of trying to certainty and structure and possibly getting into U.S. code and clearing up roles and responsibilities.
Yeah.
Clearly, we need to do that. I mean, we're kind of playing Mr. Potato Head with our government. We just keep slapping things all over the place. But I think over the past 9.5 years, at least in my foreign policy business, the thing that we see is not necessarily the existing authorities or existing structures. It's the authorities' process. Because I believe that's where we can get, no kidding, flexibility, but most importantly, agility for these novel, unique, immensely complex, and uncertain things that bubble up. And it's that blending of being able to go in and get the appropriate authority and leverage existing capacity, capability, and capacity what existing resources you have, because you can't cover it all. To me, that's where we got to go. Not necessarily seeking certainty in a clockwork plan that's going to, because it's never going to be appropriate to the situation. But authorities process, that is the adult conversation we have to have, and I think we all know where that conversation has to be had. That is where I think true efficacy is going to come from. That's just my opinion. I just wanted to get your response.
That's a great observation. I share your view. And I suppose there have been some things written now about the process of promulgating the NRF, the National Response Framework, as a new iteration of what was the National Response Plan. Apparently, I wasn't on the inside of any of this, but apparently in the early going, it was not a good process. It was very top-heavy. State and local people felt as though their voices weren't heard. They weren't invited to the table for the most part, and their comments went, in one window and out the other, or into the circular file. But there was such resistance to sort of shoving the NRF down the throats of state and local officials that DHS said, okay, we hear you, and they did it better. They did have a process that was more transparent, more fully accountable to those who were the stakeholders, as we would say. There's a lot of work to be done in that area, isn't there? And part of it's CivMil, part of it is the interagency outside of the basic CivMil divide, and of course a big part of it is that vertical arrangement between federal, state, and local. There are some good organizations such as yours that are going to work to try to improve process as well as standards and outcomes. A lot of work to be done in that area. Yeah. Peter.
Bill, in the Obama administration set up in the NSC a resilience directorate. Do you know what how effective that's been, and what was the purpose of that? And does getting rid of the Homeland Security Council, how has that played out in some of these?
Yeah, there's been very little transparent information about that effort. There was a proposal early on, as you implied, to collapse the Homeland Security Council into the NSC and have a sort of an all hazards council. It's not clear whether they're doing that in fact, and whether resilience is one of the domains that council will take upon itself to consider. Resilience, of course, is not only a buzzword here in the United States, it's a buzzword in our international commitments, as you well know. How resilient are the places where conflict has been going on? How can they bounce back, and what's our role, the United States' role in making that happen? So resilience has multiple meetings. I think there's a fair amount of work being done now in organizations such as New America, and as well as in academia and in government research, I'm sure as well now, to help define the metrics for resilience here in the domestic arena, and I think those will really be helpful going forward. So much of what DHS sought to do in the first decade of its existence wasn't based on good social science. Where are the problems and how can they be fixed? They were sort of taking a guess that maybe we needed to invest heavily in A, B, or C. Now I think we can do better at saying what are the needs, what things aren't as resilient or can be made more resilient with some investment now. Good. Yes.
Ann Peters from the Embassy of Canada. I know you mentioned that there are some multiple state arrangements or agreements for emergencies and disasters. I know of many between some provinces and states on the border, right, between Canada and the United States. Do you think, given the millions of foreign nationals that live in the United States, do you think that the U.S. governments, local, state, federal, have done enough to take into account the international aspects of disasters?
We have not. And that's a good question also. Part of the difficulty there is one that is alluded to a moment ago, the interagency process. Who's in charge of the international aspects of disasters? Is it the State Department? And the State Department, who do they talk to about that? And is it DHS? Do they marry up some way? Hopefully, you surely know more about this than I do, but I was heartened to see the bullet point agreement that that Mr. Harper and Mr. Obama made a couple of weeks ago about a security perimeter. Yeah, that's. I know that in the Canadian press, that phrase sometimes maybe it's a dirty word because of the perception that it's heavy-handed or one-sided from this view. But I saw in those bullet points some promises to do more cooperation on issues like those that we've been discussing here today. Do you think do you share that perception?
Well, I've been to many meetings with people from FEMA and State Department and
Right.
DHS, and there are a lot of informal agreements. There is a lot of partnerships between local fire departments,
Yep.
hospitals, especially along the border.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's enough federal support between the countries, but that's personal opinion, of course.
Right.
But I would agree. I don't think that there's enough done yet. I think it's going to take a major crisis to pull us all together, really. But
And maybe again, this is the compacts or the informal agreements that can be arranged may provide a more likely source for those improvements than something that's going to come from the top down. Although I did like the Obama-Harper presentation. We'll see where it goes. Yeah. Have I exhausted you yet? Maybe not quite.
Daniel Koster from the Economic Policy Institute. I'm just wondering, is there a role for martial law in all of this? If smallpox is found to be in a couple of states and the executive feels that the local response has been insufficient, is there a legal basis for them to declare martial law and just have the feds take over that way?
There is not, and I certainly hope we never get there. You know, martial law essentially means no law. So, you know, the toughest guy's in charge. That's martial law. The feds would be the toughest guy. People wearing uniforms with guns, I suppose, would be the toughest guys. I think that there's so many fail-safe mechanisms, so many ways that situation could be averted. Even the gravest kind of crisis, I think a smallpox thing out of control, there are lots of ways we could avert that. Not to diminish the gravity of a crisis like that. One of the best things about our system, of course, is that our military, the best and most professional in the world, are also absolutely subordinate to a civilian commander-in-chief. And I think that will help any tendency that we would have to allow the toughest guy to be in charge.
Feel obligated to dive in on that as well.
I'll bet you do.
If we also have not only the obligation to be subordinate to the civilian leadership, we also are morally and legally obligated to disobey any unlawful order.
That's right.
Any order that would be given to us to do something along those lines as a professional institution, we would be compelled to not obey that. So, I mean, we are not just trained; we are educated to the marrow on this sort of thing. Yeah. So there are other ways. I think those other ways are the way we would go.
Right. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Just a quick follow-up on that for my clarification.
Sure.
When you talked about the Johns Hopkins...
The Model State Act?
And it's like that New York adopted?
Yeah, very close.
And so some states are picking that kind of broad-sweeping powers.
They are.
Is anything like that... I mean, that's not been contemplated at the federal level, but that's more like a state model?
It's a state model. It couldn't be contemplated at the federal level for the reasons I said before. The federal government would lack the authority to impose that degree of control inside the states and cities. It's the commandeering thing again. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Jeff Randall, Brookings Institution. I got two kind of questions for you, and having worked several of these responses in my normal day job with the Coast Guard. Communications,
right,
and interoperability of communications is one thing that's severely lacking and probably should be prescriptive.
Right.
I know the federal government, there's some entities within DHS that are trying to work the communications operability piece, but anytime you start talking natural disaster or crisis response, hurricane or earthquake or whatever, first thing that goes away is the communications infrastructure, and you have this void. But we have a problem, I think, in getting everybody standardized, especially state and local state and local governments, to get on a common frequency of operation there.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, the other thing that we have started to see since Katrina is a mass influx of volunteers, whether it's Deepwater Horizon, Katrina. People come in and they want to help. So I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on credentialing or certifying these people that come in, so you don't end up with what happened in Katrina, where you have people coming in, rescuing dogs, and then taking them to dogfighting rings. We don't want that to happen, but there has to be some vetting process.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with the communications piece and then the volunteer credentialing piece?
Those are great points. I should have said something about communication in my opening remarks, because I fully believe that strategic communication is one of the most important ingredients in disaster, emergency preparedness, and response. The examples you gave are excellent ones. The first one that always comes to my mind when I think of this problem are the anthrax letters. You may remember almost 10 years ago that we had competing interpretations of what was going on in the state of Florida, up in New York City, and Maryland, where those letters were first being revealed. And I think there's a fair amount of attention that's been given to it, but as you say, part of it is a technical problem, an interoperability issue, and part of it, of course, is it's a microcosm of this larger question of sort of who's in charge and how you manage shared governmental arrangements. I think I agree with you. A prescriptive solution is probably required for the operability side, and Coast Guard. I've talked to Admiral Allen about this. They had a great model, and so there are technical applications that could be adopted. That seems to me to be a fix that can be done. Much more difficult to deal with what you might think of as the political problem of who speaks if there's an attack in New York City. Is it the mayor? Is it the governor? Is it the president? Is it the secretary of DHS? The New York State Department of Public Health, chief of police. So those are the kind of puzzles that I think can be imagined in advance and arranged by previous understanding, the memorandum, the agreements, the network, not a networked solution, but an MOU. And my understanding is that some of that work's been done. But it's episodic, and it's happening, in different places with respect to different kinds of crises. But I hope that more work is done there. On the latter, on the credentialing and sort of sanctioning of volunteers, privateers, the Model Act that I mentioned before takes an approach to that, to both those questions. How do you credential, and how do you then immunize, if you do immunize, the actions of those people? And the states that have adopted the Model Act have, by and large, given state and local agencies, existing agencies, the authority to provide either emergency or temporary credentialing, sort of on the spot, for people, and as a result of the credentialing, then in return immunizing them from liability. Now, that can be controversial, as you know, because you might immunize somebody who goes berserk and does a bunch of terrible things to people who are otherwise already being victimized. So it's probably something that needs to be done, to take the volunteers, take the Walmart who's willing to provide 500 trucks to get equipment from one place to another, but not open it up so that you have people who are going to do more harm than good. So there needs to be some fairly careful calibration of the kind of criteria that you use to evaluate whether credentials ought to be awarded, and maybe some kind of limitation on an immunity. Walmart won't take it, of course, without the immunity, but you have to do some trading off, it seems to me. Yeah.
How are they going to handle, when you've got a natural disaster, when you have I'm a 2005 hurricane evacuee, so when there's a natural disaster and you've gone through the storm, and you're dealing with FEMA workers and all of their subcontractors, and you say to them, how is it that, in my case, the Bush White House, can, within months of that disaster, say, okay, we're going to give tax incentives. Let's get some contractors in here. Let's start rebuilding, because the soil is filled with chemicals. You know that there's piping that's broken. And at some point, I expect to see, some strange disease, an increase in cancer. So legally, down the road, who's going to be responsible for that?
Yeah. It's hard to know, but the buck usually stops just down the street here, and I suspect that's going to be a federal responsibility. The feds certainly bore a significant share of the responsibility for the poor anticipation and response to those storms in 2005, and that they've made lots of recovery efforts and spent a lot of money. But if they did it sloppily or haphazardly or too hastily, I think it's they who are going to bear the cost down the road. It's quite a story, isn't it? And it's not yet finished. For a decade or so. Right. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Professor Banks very much for that.
Thanks.